Hi everyone. This is me and Brian again. We're back to discuss, the API design of bVirtualization. bVirtualization is a little product Brian and I have been working on to basically allow Blazor developers everywhere around the world to be able to kind of have this infinite scrolling, but we wanted to also allow it to be simplified than the native component that comes out of the box with Blazor. So basically, we want to give you the ability to pass in data sources. You want to pass in a function that does an API call. It doesn't matter what you're passing in, but more importantly, also give you meaningful exceptions. We want you, when something falls apart, there's an issue in the system, or maybe your API is doing something, wrong. We're encapsulating that and we're telling you exactly, okay, this is actually a service exception. This is a dependency exception, or maybe a validation exception. Something is wrong with your input. And as usual, I'm joined with my dear friend Brian here. Hi, Brian.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, so we're basically last time we basically were sitting down and we were talking about options, and this is one of these scenarios where we just sit down and we say, okay, let's see what the community has to say about our design. And Brian and I last time were basically going and saying, okay, how are we going to do this? We want to build a simple API, something that people could go and say, plug and play. I want a grandma in Nebraska to be able to work with our little component here. And a bunch of options came up. The idea here, just for the people who didn't see the previous session, is to basically go and say, okay, I can pass in a data source that's outside of the box. You may as well just go use the native component. And maybe I want to pass a function or an asynchronous function, to my component, and my component will know what to do with it and just run it. The most important part about this is that the footprint. I don't want the component to leak models into the consumer, but rather the other way around. Let the consumer kind of influence the component by passing in functions and types and all that kind of stuff without having any stuff to clean up or any abstractions, to clean up. So anyway, we put the word out there, and the community was really really sweet and nice. A lot of people reached out. There's this gentleman, Michael Cohen, sorry, Christopher Cohen, who actually went in there and put a very detailed response. He said, you know what, I'm thinking maybe be virtual, be vert queryable, and be vert function. So that's one of the suggestions. He really went in to say, I don't want to really switch between two components. Sorry, between options in the same component. It's just not intuitive, right? And then other people, and I was really surprised. This guy I really like a lot. I told you about him before, Brian. He's a pretty smart guy. His name is Egil Hansen,
hmm
and he basically developed this bUnit library, to basically help people. I've got the recommendations from, like, everyone around the world. Steve Sanderson himself, the guy who invented Blazor with Daniel Roth, he said to me, if you want to test drive, you want to build something enterprise level, use Eagle's library. He picked up the library and he went there and he started working with it. I was like really, really excited about this. He left us a comment here. He said, my instinct is, let me zoom in for the people on their phones. He basically said, my instinct is be to make a generic component of T type, where T is whatever data source the user wants to provide. Then in the component, detect the type and use it accordingly. If an unsupported type is passed through an appropriate exception, add support for more types over time. So he's basically saying, you tell people what your contracts are and let them kind of subscribe to it. I didn't quite, grasp, the details of it, because it's Twitter, you only have 140 characters or so. So anyway, I'm gonna use this new technology today where you can just drag and drop people into your stream. What do you think about that, Brian? Should we try it? I don't know.
Really? Let's
Yeah,
let's.
so I can just pick Eagle like this. Look, I'm dragging, right, and I'm just dropping him. What? Look at that. What on earth is that Eagle right
Hey,
there? How
hey,
did
What?
that
hey,
happen?
what's going on? How did I get here?
Did you see?
Hey, it's Hassan. It's
Did,
Brian. How are
did
you
you
guys
see?
doing?
Did you see how Eagle's like, what? What just happened?
Thank God I
Oh
put
my
on pants
god.
today. That could have been awkward.
Oh my
Uh,
God, Egil Hansen himself. I'm a big fan. I don't know what to say to you. Please sign my autograph. No, I really actually like this guy. And I want to tell you guys something, just a little bit of intro here. If you're not familiar with Eagle, but I don't know why you would. If you're following my videos, you will know Eagle. But the gentleman, he basically built this test driven development tool that helps engineers, so people who actually take their software development seriously, basically be able to test drive Blazor components, which is something that we were missing in the Blazor stack. Right, there are all these companies that build nice components like Sync Fusion, Telerik, and all of these folks, but we need to actually test drive this, so we know that if I have a large enterprise application, believe me, it gets really complicated. If you're building an end-to-end application, you want that kind of confidence that your components are doing the right thing. By the way, Eagle's library can be used for both unit and acceptance tests and integration tests. You can run it end to end and scan your loaded screen and basically make sure you verify the particular components are there. And the gentleman, he actually, we talked to each other a little bit, and he said, hey, I could probably jump in and help you. He was so generous and kind to kind of jump in with us and provide his 2 cents. So hi, Eagle.
Hi, Hassan. Hi, Brian. Let me throw a little bit of shade back at you, Hassan. Since for about a year, everybody like we have to give praise to Hassan, because Hassan is one of those people who understands that open source doesn't mean free. Like, Hassan has been sponsoring me and my work for bUnit, and I think he might have been my first sponsor on back around the time when GitHub sponsors became a thing. He was I quickly signed up and said, well, maybe there's something where I can recoup a little bit of the time I invest in this, and at least show something to the wife, so she sort of
look, what I do is real.
and it might actually pay for a little bit of some things once in a while. So mostly I spent the money on computer parts. Don't tell her, but
What a surprise.
Yeah. No, but I really appreciate Hassan has been one of like personal sponsors for every, I think the first one. So I really appreciate that, and I'm thankful also to have, you mentioned Progress, Telerik, and Sync Fusion before. That they also actually sponsoring my work with bUnit. And to be honest, I would prefer if it was mostly just companies who would dive in and be much more active in sponsoring open source projects, because they have completely different what's it called, funding available to them to do that. And I'm working actively with my own boss to try to get us into that game as well in the company I work for, because I think it's important. And I know a lot of people go out there and build open source projects, and you have that honeymoon phase with the open source project where it's exciting. You sit up till all hours in the morning and code, and all of a sudden somebody starts using your project, and it's even more exciting.
And now you're in the support phase.
But then you get into the maintenance mode, and now it's just a job. Like anything, it's like any other code base, and it's starting to rot, and it's starting to look like something you wrote last year, which it was. And now it's sort of more like a thing that you actually have to drag yourself back to look at. And you rather would work on that new idea you have for that other open source thing that nobody uses. But now you have a responsibility somehow, and I guess it depends on who you are as a person. But there's some pressure related to that, and even like small amounts of money. And to be honest, I prefer to have it from companies, because I know it's a different thing. But if you're a private person and obviously have the funding available to you, great, go and support some open source like Hassan is doing. But I think it's awesome, because as an open source maintainer myself, I can say that even a little bit, that helps with motivation when you have those long nights where you could be watching a movie with the wife. Well, you can say, well, okay, at least I get a little bit of money out of this every month, and it helps motivate you, and it helps. At least it helped me sort of keep working on this and keep adding new things. So thank you very much.
Keep working on this. A lot of things would fall apart without your library now.
So another thing I would say, if you're ever building an open source project, don't tie features to something that is being released yearly from another company. Like bUnit is tied to Blazor, so whenever Blazor pushes out new features, I basically have to do the work. So I'm basically on Steve Sanderson's and company's schedule with bUnit as well. so I've been luckily there weren't too many things I needed to change for .NET 6 release, but I was a bit worried for a little bit there. But we got it sorted. So
yeah, absolutely, Eagle. It's always a pleasure. I may have clicked that sponsor button by mistake. No, I'm just kidding with you.
You've been with me for a year. If you need to spend the money on somebody else, that's fine. That's fine,
No,
my friend. That's fine.
you know, just like Eagle said, please, you guys, open source project. Nothing says I appreciate your work, and you'll see this even in, Brian, you'd see those sometimes in like some blogs. You'd see people say, "Buy me coffee,"
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
it's not about the pizza or the coffee. I guess engineers are a little bit more healthy now. They're trying to go low on carbs and stuff, but they buy me coffee or something. It's not about the coffee. It's about, hey, I see your work. I appreciate your work enough that I'm gonna get you a cup of coffee. I think we have a great idea here in the GitHub community. In terms of sponsoring and all that. Please, guys, sponsor Eagle. He's great. He's amazing, and what he's doing. If you're building something serious, appreciate the people that are supporting you all the way to be able to build it, as quickly and as fast as possible. All right. So, Eagle, I have a question for you. So, Brian and I have been discussing this issue, and we're just trying to understand, so in here you're basically saying, my instinct is
Yeah.
to make a generic component of type T where T is whatever data source. So explain that a little bit to us. I don't know if you use draw.io or you just want to show it in code directly. However you want to explain it, brother. You go for
I
it.
can fire up.
What do you use for your architecture design, by the way?
Draw.io has, since I joined Delegate, which is a small by American standard, but a Danish consultancy. We are Microsoft Partner of the Year from Denmark.
Nice.
In 2021, I believe. So yeah, so that we are all Microsoft shop, primarily Microsoft Stack, I used to use Visio before that because that's the tool But now all my colleagues use Draw.io, so I started doing that as well.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure how I can draw this out. I think, but I can speak generally to it. So the idea is,
I'll do the drawing while you're talking.
Okay,
What do you think
okay,
about
okay.
that? Does
Yeah,
that sound
that's
like
fine. I know more people are visual.
Yeah.
I use a lot of words, maybe like you yourself do. So if you can translate what I'm saying. So the idea would be, so I think if you take the approach when you design something like a component library, any API, class library, whatever, I try to think, how will this work for the end user? How easy can I, how little documentation can I require them to actually read?
Right.
And sometimes it can't be avoided, but if you can, and I think if I understand I haven't watched all the videos on the virtualization component, but my understanding was that the goal was basically to actually make the virtualized component that is part of like a
The
first-party
Blazor.
component in Blazor,
Yeah.
make that a bit easier to work for.
That's
in
right.
90% of the time. Like in some cases, you might want to go low level, but if you just want virtualization to work, you basically want to provide a wrapper that
You want
makes
to plug and
things.
play. Yeah. Just here's a component. Here's a function. Just run.
So you have in that drawing, you have you're sort of listing up 3 different sources of data. Like
That's right.
one of them might be a function that when called would return some data, and it would be up to the function to do that work.
Yep.
And another thing would be some sort of, and I think you've been using iQueryable in your code.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I would probably just say, why not IEnumable? Why not, when you're building methods, be as accepting as you can of the input and be as providing as you can be without causing yourself trouble later on with the output returned back. So iQueryable inherit from IEnumable. I'm pretty sure that from the virtualization point of view, you could probably get away with just receiving an IEnumable, and that would open up to people having not an iQueryable, but something else if they want to do that. And under the cover, if they're using iQueryable actually, and they have that being translated into OData feed or to a SQL entity framework kind of thing, that would still automatically, I guess is the right word in this case, work for them because I guess that might just work even if you're passing in basically you're extracting an IEnumable. So because Blazor allows us to just accept a type of, we can make generic components. So we can make a component called virtualization of T, where you have a type parameter T.
That's right.
If T is either, initially it could be either an enumerable an enumerable, or it could be a
data source,
a delegate of something like that.
Yeah.
Then you, in your component, when you do the initialization, or at the construction time even, because then you will know the generic type, then you can just look at what is T actually, and then you can have, maybe you have internal helper classes that will do the different work you need. So you talked about maybe having multiple components visible outside that would sort of call into the inner. I would rather have a simple virtualization component visible to the end user, and then have hidden classes or internal classes or private classes that get delegated the work internally, because that will allow you to evolve that virtualization component's API surface without
having to create even more.
And when I said my initial instinct, it was very much initial. I didn't really think through all the design implications. You could also have a fairly simple component where you have two different inputs. You have an input that takes something that is an enumerable of T, and the other input could be an item provider kind of thing that is just a delegate that provides provides a component with an enumerable of T, so that you can sort of it's like a factory kind of thing.
So let me follow up with you on this one. Brian, you were going to say something about virtualization.
No, I was just wondering if he saw the original package, and I was just speaking about the original design. I was going to mention that when I first had the original design, it actually was 3 lines of code, and it was only targeting OData. Yeah, that's all I was saying. And
the virtual, I don't. So Egil, just so Brian is what he's trying to tell you how this came to be, right? Ideally, Brian just wanted to basically create a virtualization component that's friendly with OData. So you would just pass in, was it the endpoint, Brian?
The endpoint and the type, and that was it.
Yep.
And that's all it needed. Yeah.
So you pass in the endpoint and the type, and then when I talked a little bit, and I said to him, why don't you just make it a little bit more generic, right? Maybe there is a GraphQL on the other side. Maybe there is, a hard-coded, kind of query, skip, offset, start from, give me that much.
My mindset at the time was I mainly work with WASM, and my mindset at the time was it was the OData, and I wanted to close that gap between the API and the component.
So he fell into places where I'm mostly talking about, right? Literally, he's talking about OData and Blazor. And if you look at most of my content, of course, every now and then, I try to, teach people about the engineering standard, building things end-to-end, test-driven development and all that. That's great. But there are the things that are flashy, shiny products that I actually try to talk about and blog about and all that. And I'm having this really smart guy with years and years of experience. Brian has actually have taught me a lot of things just working with him and talking to him, and he's coming in and he's saying, hey, dude, you want to build stuff in OData and Blazor? Probably to his surprise, I said to him, okay, I'm going to put on my entrepreneur hat now, and I'm going to say, let's make this more generic, right? Let's make this, allow this to kind of integrate with any kind of technology out there, which is something I'm trying to drive with OData these days. I'm trying to break the RESTful protocol and just let people use either GPRC, WCF, whatever they want to use, to communicate with an OData component. I'm making it kind of agnostic. And that's the same thing we're trying to do with this component. So, okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I would be tempted to say that building the OData version initially, just something that does the OData, would be a good step to start with that, and then see how to generalize that. That's at least usually when I start. If I start out building something very generalized, I end up failing miserably at the Yagni principle, at least. I have to force myself to try to build the minimal thing I can do first, and then see how we can generalize that. But I see if you build a generic version, I guess you can always have an OData virtualization component that either wraps or inherits, depending on how you want to do your composition. That generalized thing, and then just have that URL as an input. So you can have something called an OData virtualization, and that just takes that URL,
That's right.
I guess the
That's
base
right.
URL or the resource part of the URL, and then I guess it understands because it's OData that you can. Oh, it's been a while, but I guess there's the skip and take
Skip. Yep. Skip and take.
and
That's
stuff like
right.
that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Skip and
Yep.
take and count are the three things we're after.
Yeah, filters, I guess, as well would be interesting.
Right. Right. Well, let me
That,
ask you that.
that,
Go
that
ahead. Go
was
ahead,
another
Brian. Go ahead.
parameter I
Go
did
ahead.
expose, and that was
Yeah.
the query filter. And that
Yeah.
was like an
Yeah.
optional one. It defaulted to an empty string. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, so this is really great, you know. So tell me about the model. So what you're saying basically, I'm just gonna try to visualize what you're saying here. You know, you're basically saying you want to create if your component is if this is your component in here, right? You want to pass in a type, which is something Brian and I already done, but the type here targets the actual data type of the data that's coming in. So you're pulling students, teachers, whatever the case may be. I'm assuming you want to do T and S in here, so two generic data types. And S would be, I'm assuming the source, and you're passing that, and you're checking if it's just a delegate or whatever the case may be. How would you materialize that idea? Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think I would just have T be the source.
Okay.
And if the source is an in-memory thing, like a list of T, well, now it's confusing because T would be list of T of
Right.
T. No,
Right.
but yeah, so
Let's say
so
T value. Let's say T
yeah,
value like
so
this.
so that would be T, not T value, that would be T source.
T
So
source. Nice.
T
Nice.
source would be something that is, I guess, at the very core an enumerable of T, or an enumerable of some value.
Yeah.
But it could also, in theory, it could also be a delegate that produces something that we can virtualize. I guess it would be a delegate that would produce as a minimum something we can
yeah.
enumerate
Yeah.
over. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you pass if T source is set to a func that returns an enumerable of something, then that would work as well. So I would probably. I think this is probably where I would jump into just Visual Studio Code or some code editor and just type out the like the root class, because I think it's hard to visualize graphically.
Yeah. Let's do that. Do you want to do it? Do you want me to write the code? Whatever you want to do.
Let me open up. Let me just, before I share my screen, close my work stuff down so I don't get into any NDR. I don't want to get into trouble with my.
How many times I have to trim these YouTube videos? You have no idea.
That pop up from the boss that jumps in on screen while you're doing your thing.
Hey, the system's down.
Yeah. You did it again, Hassan.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So yeah. So okay. So let's see. No. So we have type param T source. So this is just. I'm just gonna do code, and I know you like to split them out, Hassan, but I'm just gonna do code and Blazor together.
Go for it.
Zoom.
Oh, thank you so
Actually,
much for zooming in. This is
even better. What I can do, because I have your project open here, and let me just create just a new. Let's call it Egil virtualize.razor, just to. Because here, let me know if this. Should I zoom a bit more? Should we have it at 200 perhaps?
So basically, Brian and I, what we do, you're gonna have to kind of increase the display to 170. What do you do, Brian? Do you do 175 or?
Yeah, I've been doing 175, but I'm just using a 1080p monitor. So
Yeah.
I usually I can put it up to 250. I usually have it at 150 when I stream on Twitch, but I hope this is large enough. I think
150 is perfect. If you can do it 150 and you just zoom tiny bit. So right now you're at 250. No, wait. So the zoom on the code itself is okay. It's your solution tree. that
Oh,
you can't control, right? So anyway, okay, let's go to 250. I think people just gonna have to kind of see it on.
if they need, I can zoom in like this.
Ooh, magic. How do you do
How'd you do
that?
that?
It's called it's from a colleague of yours, Mark Rusinovich. Zoom it.
Okay,
So
okay.
and then it's you can zoom into that, and you can use the scroll wheel, and you can even
Nice.
draw. And there's also other
What?
shortcuts. I know you've seen Mark Hanselman's videos where
Yeah,
he's able to add arrows. This is from the
yeah.
tool. I only know how to draw freehand, but there's also boxes and arrows you can add. And then just hit escape, and you're back to where you were before. So it's yeah. So zoom it,
Nice.
and it's free. It's just it's like a portable app. You just run it when you need to. There's no installation. So yeah.
Nice.
Oh,
Nice.
we don't
Okay.
need that one anymore.
Let's go
Anyway,
back to the code. So,
I
so okay,
digress.
so zoom your code to 250 the way you were, but it's fine with the solution tree, just if in case we
Okay.
need to add a file. Yeah, thank you so much.
So something like this, T source, and then yeah, I'm probably gonna regretting writing this in code. But at this, so if we go in and just go and delete my, I'm just gonna add a new page. Let's call it index.razor. So let's build.
Brian, this guy's fast. Yeah, he's running on
So
the
we
keyboard.
call.
We're gonna have to put another name on the copyright editor.
Oh, that's okay. You can keep it for yourself. I have enough open source responsibilities for one
Yeah,
lifetime.
it's like please please
So-
no.
So the thing is here, we have, well, okay, sorry, we need something. We need a parameter, public. Well, sometimes I go so fast I don't hit the right keys. So T source, and source. Naming is hard, but we can figure that out. Maybe it's not called source. Maybe it's called something else.
You got a fixed parameter there.
Parameter.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so now I just want to virtualize this thing, and I need to pass in a source. So if my source is private enumerable of string, it's not going to be a very interesting list, but it could be something like that. Let's call it source and numerable dot let's use
Range or
array dot empty. It doesn't
Okay.
matter. Just have to be something, right?
Yep.
So now we have a statically typed thing. We can do source and we can pass in the source.
Right.
So now this sometimes you can't catch these guys here, but you can see it knows it's a numerable of string. So in theory, in here, I could say what's it over? Well, actually, we can just do this as a constructor. So public Egil virtualize. So at this point, I know what T source is. I can do type of T source, and I know my
Type.
source type,
Yeah.
something like that. And based on that, I can decide what to do about this.
Right.
So in this case, it's enumerable, but it could also be, I guess, private.
A delegate.
A delegate that
Yeah.
gets source. I don't know.
That's right.
And that's basically a simple delegate that does this thing. And now I kind of wish it would show what T source is set to now. But now it's set to something that takes no parameters and returns this. So it's basically what is a delegate? I guess I'm not allowed to do that in these kinds of files. But the idea is basically you pass in something. It could also be that you have some conventions. So the problem with this design, and I realize that after I wrote that tweet, is that you are not. It might not be super discoverable what options you have. So if you have something like take because
There you go.
yeah,
Now we're cooking. Yep, yep,
yeah.
yep.
But if you want to allow, this could be something that you just call it could also
Just give me the data and I'll work
so
with it. Yeah,
you allow
yeah.
different things to be passed and then decide on that. But you know that then you need to tell people, well, you can basically pass in something, and if it's not something we like, you get a runtime exception. You get an argument exception at runtime. So it's not very type safe in that sense. But on the other hand, it's very flexible. Right, it's super flexible.
I thought you wanted to enforce I love that you're keeping it primitive. You're basically saying, no, I don't want to. You don't have to follow a contract. Please go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, but so it's sort of a design, like it's where do you want to take a library? So you can decide on being very, do I want to get a compile time error, or do I want to have something that is flexible? And this one is complaining because it doesn't know which one I'm binding to, so that's why it's mad at me. But yeah, so you can do that, and then you can just have like I don't know if I'm allowed to have private classes in here, but you can have a private class of this would be like a delegating virtualizer or something like that. That would be that. Well, in case we say, well, okay, this is actually this type. Well, then I'm gonna, or maybe it's just a function I have in here that handles if it's a delegate, or if it's just an enumerable. Then I have a different function that handles writing that out.
Right.
So that was the amount of thought I've put into this idea.
Yep.
I like it.
What do you think, Brian? Go ahead.
Yeah. No, it just opened my eyes a bit. So.
This is actually genius. I'm just, while you're writing this, I'm sorry, my enterprise brain is saying we need to test drive this. We need to see.
I'm going to get off the session so I can fiddle.
So there's this aspect. We definitely, Egil, I really appreciate this. This is actually a really beautiful solution. We're gonna try to play around with it, at least, in the next session for this.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something else you wanted to tell us about also, in terms of. I'll let you go ahead. And in terms of parameters, I think you were talking about something.
Let me clean up this bit here, just so I am back to a compiling state.
Brian, check this out. Watch. Fasten your seatbelt. This is going to be cool. Go ahead.
Okay. So another tweet I sent, that was for the previous video. And I also actually commented on YouTube because there's, a bit more than 280 characters there, was around, and to be honest, that's a feeling of my design skills is that I saw your video, and I saw how you were passing parameters when you were testing Blazor components with bUnit.
Yeah.
And you were using
the parameter
it's sort
creator.
of a very parameter creator, and it's a very verbose thing. It's not really type safe because so I actually
it should be right there.
But I this is my I forked the thing you have there. So let me go and obviously I committed my changes. So let me see if I can. So I can never find my recent repository. So if I go in here, and now I can. There's your repository, right?
Yep,
so if you go in here and have a look at the tests, and it's under here, and it's under here again, and scroll down a bit. I'm gonna zoom. Hope this is.
It should be right there. Yeah, if you scroll down, there it is.
So here. So the basic construct I have in render component, which is a bUnit test context method that is able to render that component you pass to it. Well, you need to pass parameters into that component in a Blazor way, and the basic construct I have, because there's a type built into Blazor, but that's internal, so I can't use that. So I created my own type called a component parameter. And to make it easy for some internal parts of bUnit to construct component parameters, I have a component parameter. Sort of, it's a factory and it's a type in itself. But basically, I have some great parameter method that takes the name of the parameter you want to create, and then whatever type you have. And it's a string to whatever object you have. So it's not super type safe. Like this here, you're using name of. So at least if you go and, child content is a special thing. But if you go and rename data source in your bVirtualize component type,
and everything will break.
Then it will still be at least doc type safe. We can call it that. But if you change the data type you expect for data source to something else, then you will get a runtime error. It's not so.
It's not type safe. Yeah.
No. So what I actually have in bUnit is in this on this method, I also have another overload, and that takes a builder that is strongly typed. So let me show you that. So
really?
I wrote some code. So and now I know you have a very specific way you like to write your test, Hassan. I don't know about. I've seen that in previous videos from Hassan, Brian. So I don't know if it's your way as well. And I really commend Hassan for being consistent. So consistency is king when you're writing code. I believe it's like you talk about being a professional engineer a lot, Hassan. For me, professionalism is about consistency. You can be if you do the same thing that is maybe not the best way to do things, but if you're consistent, then you leave yourself a much easier path to refactor that to later.
You're easy to maintain.
It's easier for people to understand. So if you're consistently bad, that's better than being inconsistent, having good parts and bad parts. So if that makes sense at all.
Yeah.
So
I gotcha.
Okay. So this is just a newing up a component. So my point about saying that consistency, I might have broken a bit with consistency just because I sort of rewrote a few things, and so I hope you can bear with me. This test, we can get back to that. I would like to challenge you if you actually need this, or if you're just testing, like what you're actually getting by this test. Another test you had is, now this one might actually be something I've added. You called it something differently, and if we go back here, so no, you didn't have that one. You have this one.
Are you talking about the theory data kind of?
No, I just need to make sure I should render content. So we can get back to this one. This is another one I added because, and if we look at this, should render content. This is your test. And this is my version. And let me collapse this so we have a bit more. Here you see, so I have a couple of things. We can get back to what autodata is and theory is. And
I never knew you could do that. Brian, did you know about this, that theory data? What?
I'll so just pretend. So I should have kept some steps. So I'm like a TV chef. But I didn't show you all the steps between. I just took it out of the oven and it's done. So, but I'll get back to what this is. This is just the input, like the bVirtualize component. It has a property called called data source that takes an IC variable. So, but what we have here is, this is still the same render component method, but it has an overload that takes, it's not giving me a lot of help here, but it takes a builder pattern. So a builder is something that allows us to build up that parameter array, but in a strongly typed way. So the reason why I say parameters over into parameters is because this. Let me see if I'm able to zoom in before I am. Haha. So here you can see this is what you are getting passed into your Lambda here is a component parameter collection builder. That's a mouthful of type bVirtualization component of objects. So, and it knows what type it is because that's what you're declaring here. So we are basically declaring a Lambda here where we are passed in a component parameter collection builder. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
And that method, it has a whole bunch of things on it. It has a whole bunch of add methods. And an add method in this case is something that takes two things. Generally, it takes I can call it a parameter selector lambda. So let me comment this out and let's write it again together so you can sort of see the intelligence you get from this. So we are saying render component. We want bVirtualize of objects. And let me just type PS for short here. And now we have a piece. I usually just dump down to the next line because otherwise these tend to get long. So down here, I'm calling on the PS. We have the new fancy intelligence helping us out here. So add allows me to go ahead and select a parameter I want to pass data into. So this is me static type it.
Statically typing. Brian, help us out here.
This is we need somebody who's not speaking English, but actually English to help out here. No, so I know maybe conventionally you would use X for your lambdas, but I like to use P because it's a parameter I'm selecting. So P now, again, I'm zooming in as fast as I can. You can see P is actually set to the component we are trying to render. So P dot, and if I want to, I want to pass something into, it could be label, if we go ahead and zoom in here. So these are all the things. I know that it's only this one here and this one that are actually properties.
That's right.
Excuse me, that's my phone going nuts over there. So these two are the ones that are relevant. So I can say data source here. And now the second thing I need to pass to add is actually something that is data source compatible. So I can't, so it forces me to actually align with that. And you can see right away when I just pass in an object of an array object,
it will complain.
It'll say, hey, you can't convert. No, I almost caught seriously. That. Here we go. So now it says, well, we can't implicitly convert. This doesn't make sense at all. So this should be data source. then it's going to make much more sense.
Right.
So we can't convert an iQueryable of object to an. Why does it keep saying? Well, it's complaining because this is not an iQueryable. This isn't. That's why I have as queryable here, and now it's happy. So if you refactor this property now parameter, then obviously it works the same as what you had before, but it also enforces you to pass in a legal type. And the other thing we want to pass in is child content. And because child content, if we click and go to that, we can see child content here is actually a render fragment of T. A render fragment of T is a templated render fragment. So it's a render fragment that takes some input. So to make dealing with these types of inputs a bit easier in this context here, you can basically pass in something that takes, like you can see up here, we
component,
it could be some value. So a render fragment of T is something that takes a value and returns a render fragment.
So you're creating a fragment on the fly, basically.
Yeah, but so what this method does, it has, again, going in here, we can see there's a whole bunch of overloads, and this one, it has the parameter select, and you can just pass in a value. You can also pass in an action that takes and just does something. Let me see if I can find the right version of this. Well, the point is there's a bunch of overloads here, and one of them is something along the lines of say, okay, I just gonna want to make a simple basically template. So in here we're saying, well, I'm gonna pass in a value, and so this is sort of a simple, it takes a value, this is a lambda that takes a value, and it generates a markup for you. This will, by bUnit, be translated into a render fragment of T that has the right signature. And we can see here, because we have object over here, we also get value is a type of object. If we change this to, say, let me change that to string, for example, then this is now a string. So it flows all the way through. So it understands that child content is of type string, and then it knows that you want to do something. This is not a render fragment. This is just a lambda method that takes a string as input and returns a string as output. That's one way you can do it. You can also do a real render fragment that looks like this. Render fragments is just a delegate that takes a render tree builder and returns a void. This looks like this, and now we can say builder dot open component, and you can do your whole thing. You can create this as a method as well, and that will also work. So there's a bunch of different overloads you can use for usually for test in a test context. I'm just gonna remove this and comment this back in again. In a test context, this is just keeping everything local, so you understand, okay, now instead of what we had before where you say, well, now so
No, it's down.
I ignore
Yeah,
looking at
yeah,
state, but
yeah,
you basically go
yeah.
and say, I expect to have this right child content, I expect to have the right data source, and so on and so forth, and you expect to find some components of this type because that was what you originally passed in
Yep.
through the custom render component you build up here.
Yep.
I just say, well, okay, I know that I expect this to be called a bunch of times. In fact, this component, this small template here should be called 3 times. And since I'm creating p tags, I expect to have p tags, and I want to have a number of those. I want to have count of the same amount I have up here in my data source. And that's how I know that virtualization component has done the right thing, right? It has used my child content. At least that's one way to go about it. Obviously, you can't do that assertion you did before, where you go in explicitly and say you had cut.instance.child content should be
equivalent to
be equivalent be my render fragment that I had before.
That's right.
You can do the same thing here. You can create a render fragment of objects, and that would be O over to B over to an empty thing. So this is a render fragment of object. It doesn't do anything, but it's there.
Nice.
And if you pass that in as well, you can do this. But then this won't work, obviously, because that's not actually. This is that we don't do anything in here. We're not spitting out any markup. So this would be the equivalent. I know this is super terse, and but that's sort of equivalent.
So let me ask you something.
Go ahead.
So when I try, if you'd allow me, Egil, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but here's one thing I have with this. Okay. This is amazing. This is very straightforward. You don't have to create parameters or anything at all. But the thing about using libraries on APIs is that they need to be easy to remember. You know what I mean? Brian, correct me if I'm wrong. Can you come up with this off the top of your head? Like, even if you did it like 10 times. This is what I'm struggling with, Egil. I love this. This is great. But think about this. I'm not just writing software. I mentor people. I try to kind of get to their level and actually try to bring them up. And usually, and I always tell people this. I said, don't try to memorize anything, right? But you have the muscle memory to kind of use the library. Please, forgive me. I'm just trying to kind of have the conversation with you.
Yeah.
This is a little hard to remember. If I'm teaching someone Blazor and I'm going, at least for me, and I'm really slow. Brian knows, we had this discussion the other day. I said to him, I'm not smart. I'm just working.
Don't sell yourself short, Hansen.
I'll just tell you this much. I'm just working while the smart ones are asleep. But this one, if I'm trying to kind of explain passing parameters, especially to back-end engineers, because pretty much that's my job, has been my job, in for a period of time. Can you make this easy? Can you make this like, I just want to pass in the parameters, and somehow it knows that when I want to pass a value to data source, it doesn't complain about making a setter, right? There you go. So it's, okay. So if I do name
that
off,
was my first version, where you basically represent so in Blazor, a property, a parameter, that's a name of the parameter and some object, and it's actually bound using reflection on runtime. So my initial idea was to say, I'm going to make if you go ahead and take a look at the component parameter type in bUnit, you will see that it is implicitly convertible from a tuple of this that looks like this, of a tuple of string to object. Yeah, but again, not strongly typed. It's stringly typed, and it doesn't validate the type here. So that's why, with a community member, I came up with this builder pattern. And I understand. I completely get what you're saying. I'm not sort of saying that this. I find myself. This is easier to work with. What we do have, we have the ability to support things like this. This is clearly not a render fragment of T, but it's something that we can internally convert to a render fragment T. So if you get into the habit of saying parameters to parameters and then do .add, select your parameter, data source in this case, then you will have a lot of help figuring out passing in something that is legal, so you don't have to fight with Blazor. But I get what you're saying. I know it's not easier. I actually have a different option, which is far better, I think. And I'm going to show you that now. But this,
this is really fun.
Don't fall off your chair. Don't fall off your chair. So
I'm holding on to my seat.
Good. Okay, so this is, so let me just zoom in here. So in my test project up here, well, we can't see it there. We have something. I just to avoid name conflicts, I have a Razor component, and it's called virtualization component Razor test.razor.
That's right.
And we also added an imports file here that looks suspiciously like the usual imports, but we have a whole bunch of
XUnit
test stuff there as well.
Yeah.
And I also went to the test project. That was not the test project. I went to the test project and I added this to the SDK type. That allows us to have Razor components in the test project that is compiled when you do control B or build your project. So now it's actually a proper Razor component library. And what you can do is you can actually write tests, just regular XUnit test in Razor files. And it works this way. And currently with XUnit, you have, basically you have to inherit from something that is not like by default, Blazor components inherit from component base. And they have certain expectations related to that. But now we are writing a test component, so you have to explicitly go and say, I'm going to inherit from the bUnit test context. You can also create your own test base if you want to do more advanced stuff, but this is a good starting point. And if we scroll past all of these, let me collapse those so they don't steal our focus. And let me show you what we have here instead. So if you want to write tests like this, you can actually do what is called an inline render template, I believe, if you Google that. That's the official name you can see. And that is, so we are in a code block here in a Razor file. We all seen that before. But here, because we add the @ sign, we can enter into HTML or markup mode inside our code. And that allows us to have just Razor markup in our C# code. So we are in a Razor file in code mode, and then we go back to markup mode. So, and this is pretty fun. So we have this method in bUnit. This is also part of a test context called render. And it just takes a render fragment. And when you add an @ sign here, you're creating a render fragment. So instead of all that we looked at before, which was not super intrusive. Here we are simply passing in. You can see when I double click on this, it highlights this. It's pointing up to this. So this is just referencing that. We can even call to as our query one this to make this work. And the template I had to create with that sort of lambda function before, it's just markup directly. And the context, that is just a Blazor thing. Like if you have what's it called? Like if you passing in, if you have a custom template function, like then this is implicit. This is implicit, the implicit variable that Blazor creates for you. And I can even zoom in here, and you can see that its string is of type content, and it's of type content because the data source is an array of strings, and we passed in data source, that one. So the string up here gets passed in here, and then we know that now our T type of
it's actually what's
it's a string, and then context becomes that. And now we have the same assertion as we had before over here. So if we switch back to, let me find the right test to switch back to. So this test is the same. We can have them next to each other. It's not going to work because they have the same name.
Just to compare,
It's just to compare, and the comparison work because you can see it's highlighting the two things. So these tests do the exact same thing. So here we are asking the Blazor compiler that runs when you build your Razor component to generate a render fragment for us. Here we are using the component parameter builder in bUnit, which actually ends up creating a render fragment behind the scenes. So this is a programmatic way of doing this.
Done,
And this is just using the so this one I would without a doubt, always recommend. I know people don't necessarily like code in the Razor files.
I was just gonna tell you markup obtrusive, but go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
But this I think this is the pragmatic approach. And you see, you could write some markup up here. You can write some text that it wouldn't do anything because this component, this test component is not being rendered. It's not part of the usual render cycle as such. Nice. It's just being newed up because it's just a class. It's just compiled into a C# class, and then XUnit sees, oh, there's a class that has a method that has a fact attribute on it, so I'm just going to treat it like a normal XUnit test, and then I'm just going to new it up normally, and because it has a default constructor, because that's the rules of Blazor components, they have to have a default constructor, so it just treat it like a regular C# XUnit test. So this is much easier. The only reason I wouldn't necessarily recommend this to all is that IntelliSense is still sometimes a bit lacking. It's much better in Visual Studio 2022 with you can go to definition and all sorts of great stuff within Razor files, but this way, especially if you get into the more complex things where you have multiple parameters, you have multiple nested render fragments you want to pass in, this is much easier to work with, and this is much more natural to folks that are used to writing their code in Blazor. So this is very close to what you can do, and you still have everything working. And so yeah. And
this is actually, I'll tell you this much, I could talk about obtrusiveness, but this is actually mind-blowing. I've never thought of writing the test in the Razor file, so you can just pass the component.
Yeah, and you can see down here. You can see down here. We have it down here. So bvisualize component Razor test, and if I expand this out and I double click on this one, it takes me to the test. So you can navigate to the test as well. So it works like the only thing I'm missing. And you will note that, and I've raised an issue with your colleagues in Microsoft about this, and hope they. So here we have all this good stuff, like all of this, and the ability to run your test directly from here. I don't have that in here. So the test bits and pieces in Visual Studio don't expect you to write unit test in your Razor files, and that's why they are saying that's why it's not showing up, because in theory it should be able. It should
be able to tell you the results on the.
So it is able to just navigate to the thing here. So I told you, I sort of showed you the finished cake. I didn't show you the in between. So what is this and where is this coming from? So let's get back to this one. Let me. I'm just going to jump back in here because.
Please, by all means, go ahead.
So I started using, since I joined Delegate 1 year ago. They were big proponents of AutoFixture. AutoFixture is a great library originally built by Mark Seaman, who's a brilliant guy doing lots of F# now, but he's written the book on dependency injection for C#, among other things. And so Autodata is a way to generate data for your tests that are not specific to the test you're writing. So in this case, we need some input data. We don't care about what that input data is. It's not important to the test. But we need sometimes you need to fill data into the system on the test you're working with for that test to run. But you don't care if the string has bips or bobs in it or foos and bars. And instead of trying to make up some gobbledygook like you had in your in your original test here, you have a whole bunch of create random object. So basically, AutoFixture is all of this thing.
Takes care of that stuff.
Yeah. And it basically has some simple, like if and so you can use it manually. You can say var fixture and new fixture. And it's part of the I haven't imported that. So you new that up, and then you can do fixture.create, and then you say I want a string, and then it will give you just a randomized string. It's
nice, nice.
And then you can sort of have your whole. I think you call it given here, but a range step, that initial setup step where you sort of just generate some data. And autofixture, sort of the thing you need to learn about autofixture is that if you ask for an array or enumerable of things, you get free. So in this case, we get free objects. We should probably just call this strings.
Does it autofill custom types too?
It does do that as well. So if you have a simple POCO like or a DTO like a data structure object with getters and setters, it will look at that and it will just go down that object tree and put in some random data there.
That's
for
insane.
you.
Nice.
In this case, if we put a breakpoint here, let me jump over to my Razor test just to show you that you can also debug here. So, and that's another thing with bUnit. If you ever wanted to debug a Blazor component and you couldn't get the debugger to work because your Blazor WASM or whatever, then the shortest way to get things debugging in Blazor, everybody, is to use bUnit. And because you just write a test, and if you don't have to have any insertions, you can just render the thing you want to debug and pass in the parameters, and then you are stepping into your code. So let's see if we can find. So I'm gonna go ahead and just quickly just remove that, and maybe just to make it a bit easier to find the tests. These are very long, and this should render content. So we right click and debug that. So it should be here in a second now. Yeah, okay. Nice. So let's see. Let me go ahead and get my locals out, and we can inspect this, and I can zoom in for you guys. So here you can see we got an input array of strings, and it just creates, let me zoom in on the strings instead. It's just GUIDs with something in there. So it's new every time you run the test, which can also be a good way to verify weird assumptions you might have had if you, for example, hard code some text. So we just get that from the Autodata. Autodata is an extension to Autofixture for XUnit. There's similar extensions to NUnit and MS Test, if you like that.
Nice.
Where you basically say, I just declare theory because that's how we tell. It's not because we know, but it's just allows us to have input variables, and everything we declare in here as input, Autofixture will try to generate for us. If it can't, you'll get an exception, and then you can help it out by providing custom extensions to it. But in this case, this works as expected. And if I need to step in and here, so we stepped over the component and we got in here, and now we have our component on the test. I call it cut. That's sort of inspired by system under test, which I'm sure you know from just XUnit nomenclature, but a component under test, so cut instead of sut. And in here we just have our component under test where you can see the component ID, and we can get access to the instance, and we can get access to the markup. And obviously we can get access to the DOM tree, which is provided to us by AngleSharp as well, and all the other stuff that is available there.
Here's another question for you.
Yeah.
Can it actually find out truly like domain specific random data? Like when we use the dynamics, I can go and say, give me random real people names. Does Autofixture give you that?
No. If it's a string, it gives you something like you saw before. So it is for truly data that is not test specific. I think I haven't tried it, but I've seen things like bogus as well, where you can say, give me a credit card number, and it will give you a random credit card number.
I tried bogus library. The only problem with it is that it asks you to set up every property. And that I didn't like. And then some other guy had to write another library to autofill. I'm like, why would I trade one NuGet package for two NuGet packages? But I see what you're saying. Okay.
So with Autofixture, it's completely, and you can go in and you can add to Autofixture. You can go in and add. It's called specimen builders. And a specimen is just something. So you can go in and say, if I have this email type, for example, or if I have that, I don't care about the email, but it has to have special form. It has to have some part, and then have an @, and then it has to have some other part, and then a dot something. Like it has to look like an email, but I don't care what the email actually is. Then you can go in and say, you can go in and add these specimen builders customizations to Autofixture, where you tell it, well, whenever somebody asks you to create this thing, you can't just create a string. right? You have to have something that is random, but it looks like have the structure. So you can go in and add to that. So we're using AutoFixture with quite a bit of success at work. Obviously, for data that needs to be specific to the test because you're trying something specific out, then that is something you sort of, that is test specific. So that's where you go in and not use auto-generated data necessarily.
I have a suggestion for you. If you go back to the place where you passed in tuples, as parameters. Do you remember that part? So just out of curiosity, what would it be if you because that's the simplest thing I've ever seen, what you just did. That's even better than what we do today and everything else, This render component, and you passed in two tuples, right? Is there a way that underneath you can examine that tuple by looking at the type of, you're passing in the name of a property, right?
Yeah.
So you can check out the type of that property and then examine it against the value that is being passed in. I'm telling you this right now, like a marketing perspective, that's really easy,
Yes. So I think what will happen. So I stopped advocating that on my website on bUnit. I only basically document the builder pattern and the one you see over here, because I generally believe these are going to be better long term. But the tuple support is there, but it only works well if you have for like regular parameter. If you're passing in a string, or you're passing in a number, or passing in something that is like an object. But if you're passing in another Blazor construct, if you're passing in a child component, like, then you have, if you want to represent that as like child content, and then, but what do you put in here then for the child component? Like you can't really describe that. Do you know what I mean? So the tuple way was with the first one I thought of, and the first one I did with bUnit, but I quickly realized it works only until you need to pass a child component or some other render fragment, and then you need something else. And then initially I had sort of like component parameter. I had that's why we have creates. Then the create, there was child content method you can call that would then itself take tuples and so on and so forth. And then you had a Christmas tree kind of a thing going on, because then you would have something like this but
gotcha.
When as soon as you get into something that is a bit more complex, then it turned out that, and you can go in here to bUnit.dev. This is the website, and then under documentation, and then excuse me, parameters and cascading values. And here I show a whole bunch of examples where we have the C# version of the code, like the one you're seeing here, and then we have the Razor version, and you can sort of toggle back and forth and see the two different compared to each other.
Nice.
So originally I had 3 or 4 different variants basically, but I tried to slow it down, limit it, because I have to support that code. But it quickly becomes a bit more convoluted when you have things like event handlers, like in this case here, and in this case you can just pass in directly. But with the tuple version, it started sort of, the pattern started to fall down. But what will happen is, if for some reason, if you want something that is maybe you want to pass in an unmatched parameter, like that you're able to pass in just you're able to do something like virtualize. Well, I guess I don't have that included.
It should find it for you, virtualization.
Oh yeah, but it's because it's not in the. Either way, I can go foo equals bar here. And if you add something called that, a special parameter, getting the parameter called the capture all unmatched something, I can't remember precisely what it's called.
Right.
Yeah, that is also allowed if you want to. Exactly. Thank you, Brian. So if your component is set up for that, what bUnit allows you to do, let me find that again. You can simply do instead of passing in a parameter selector, you can do this, and it will work the same. So you're able to you're able to not use the parameter selector, but then you lose the
data type check. Yeah.
You use all that good stuff. So I am actually considering writing sort of an analyzer that will suggest this pattern here, especially compared to the one you were using before with the component parameter factory methods, because that is something that is there for legacy reason. I couldn't get myself to remove it because I knew people were using it some places,
right.
and also in
many places.
Yeah. So even though I find this much better, and then this will also go in and actually double check things like if you select a type that is. You can select a property that is actually not a parameter. Like you have properties on here, like what was it?
Like label.
Yeah.
Yep.
And label, it's not
a parameter.
Yeah, it even gives me a warning here. Oh, it's because the type doesn't match. But if we had something, if we changed to this, for example, and then had a string here, well, then it doesn't complain. But as soon as we run the test, it will fail because it will say.
You can't set it up on the,
Oh, I also have, it's complaining about this. So if you hear Homer in the background complaining, it's just, I have Visual Studio set up so it's making sounds when my test pass or fail. In this case, it failed. And if we go down here and have a look at the test, you will see there's the parameter selector, blah, 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 p message.
Public property on the component.
Does not resolve to public property on this component. So you selected something that wasn't legal. So I think what you were alluding to before, Hansen, is that there's definitely something built in that checks if this is legal. Like if you're trying to do something that doesn't make sense from a Blazor point of view.
Yeah.
Okay,
so you had something on the initial render test. Go ahead.
So the original should render content. It also it had a bunch of different assertions in there. Let me go back. No, not that far back. I think here. So if you go in here.
This one, the top one.
So all of these assertions here, they check the state, they check child content, they check data source, and then you go ahead and find the component that was supposed to be added, and you check that was indeed added free. That's sort of the same thing I'm doing with and then you check error message and label. And then I looked at the code and I read the test name should render content. And I saw all those assertions. I said, well, the assertions tell me one thing, but the name of the test tells me something else. And what it told me was that we needed another test. So I took the liberty of adding another test called should set parameter, and this is basically because you were sort of testing two things in one there, and I'm not against having multiple assertions in a test.
No, you're good.
But it should be one logical assertion. It should sort of relate to things. So this is sort of getting back to what you were doing before, where you create a render fragment and pass that in and verify that it's actually the same as the one you expected, and so on and so forth. So and this is sort of interesting to me, and I see when you're doing test-driven development, you sort of get into this where you have a simple test that just instantiates your thing and then you pass in. But would you actually consider this test useful now that we have this test? Does this test add any value?
Well, let me ask you this: how do you know someone is not? So one of the most important things about unit testing is to basically protect your component against any change that is, not test driven, right?
Yeah, regression.
Bring in an intern, they're just learning about unit test and be like, let me change this class, right? And then your unit test will be like, totally cool, shaka bra, go in and let's merge it, right?
Yeah.
So the original test that says make sure all these public properties, everything is set up. Like if you scroll all the way to the top, there's this should initialize component at the very top. Not this one, at the one above it.
Oh yeah, this one. Yeah.
This one here. This one here says nobody's sneaking in default data in your system. Like for instance, if I
Yeah.
know that my error, go ahead.
No, I'm just nodding and agreeing and making
Yep,
sounds.
yep,
So you
yep.
can continue talking.
If
Yeah.
I know my error, my default initial data on that component
Yeah.
has any initial data that is not authorized, this is gonna catch it. It's gonna say, wait a
Yeah.
second, dude, you can't just pass in data there. Because what does that mean? It means that your component will render with that initial data, right? It may or may not render with that initial data, right? Without your test actually complaining about it.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So I buy that argument. I like that. I like that you are verifying that nobody is changing the initial public perceivable state of the component, or
Right.
the in this test in this case it's just the class basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Now,
I
let me ask
think
you this before we
yeah
go to that. The
yeah.
other one is that ensuring that the error message is null and the error label is null in the happy path scenario. How do you how do you verify, right, that someone did not just go and jumble up the states and said when the status content render error message anyway? How do you know that? Like if you go and change your error message and you go and say, even though you loaded perfectly, they just added in code in there that said render error message anyway. How do you catch that in your test? Go ahead.
Yeah. So it's an interesting proposition, I think, with Blazor and Blazor
Mhm.
tests, because are you so are you do you care about the we can call it pub-ternal, but sort of internal state of a component. So a component doesn't know how to render itself. We have the Blazor render that takes care of that.
That's
It
right.
takes whatever you have there and spits out markup.
Right.
So the end user uses, sees what's on screen.
Uh-huh.
And if that is correct, then
Who
does
cares
it
what's going on
yeah
internally?
like it's sort of
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I go back. I'm a big fan of Mark Seaman as well. We were talking about our coding heroes before we
Uh-huh.
started streaming.
Yeah.
Mark Seaman has a bunch of articles around state-based testing versus interaction-based testing. Interaction-based testing is usually something you see when you do a lot of mocking, where
Yep.
you say, well, I expect that you call this and this and this component and do it in this way with this data,
Yep.
and then you get this back.
Yep.
And that's sort of then you are tying your test to tightly coupling your test to an implementation detail in that system on the test you're testing.
Yep.
And if you ever want to change that implementation detail of how you're talking to dependencies to some way that might be more smarter, but still produces the same output,
Yep.
well, should your test fail? Or is it an implementation
Yeah,
detail?
that's yeah. So yeah,
So
I know
state,
there's two schools of thought there.
yeah,
I know some
yeah,
people say I know some people say I don't care about how you got to that outcome. I care
yeah,
that you have the outcome. But
yeah,
that I would definitely do that approach in like the acceptance test, like me saying, let me actually hit the dependency end to
yeah,
end. And then I don't care if the error message is null or not. This is where I go and use your library to go and say, find actual tags and mark up, components
yeah.
on the screen, and I don't worry about the other. But you're at the unit level. This is where you're gonna go and say, they call it unit for a reason. You want to make sure that even the sequence, brother, the sequence has to go in that particular order, because in some orchestration services, if you're calling one dependency before the other, you're almost inevitably is going to fail. You can't create a library card before you create a student, right? You need to create a student first and then create a library card. Go ahead,
Yeah,
go ahead, go ahead,
I
go ahead.
agree with. It's not an easy. It's not a. I'm not saying never use mocks, for example. But I like that thought. So my point was really not that your should render content shouldn't verify that error message label, because
Yeah,
I get that. I see if it's important that the hyperpath test should render out content correctly, and then there shouldn't be any errors, because then it's not a happy path.
yeah.
But for me, so then we get back to naming and being consistent, and then I'm maybe not be too familiar with your style, but if I'm new on a Hassan project, I might say, well, why is my should render content also verifying things that are not related to rendering the content necessarily? I would expect to have another test that says, you know, something should not
render
have
with
error
no
label.
errors.
Yeah,
for
yeah. I
instance, or
would
something.
probably
Yeah.
have an additional test for that specific scenario.
Right,
It seems like
right.
it's too different. So I think it's super interesting to hear your thoughts on
Yeah,
this, because
yeah,
it's
absolutely.
I have no I don't have the there's no I don't really like dogma in terms of coding. There's many good ways. So it's super interesting. Like, we can also talk about naming test. I don't really know how to do that necessarily. I try to be consistent with the
I've seen
project,
people
but there
use
are many schools like
underscores and
yeah yeah.
absolutely. Go ahead, Egil.
So there's some interesting things there. But so I want to show you sort of a preview feature as well, because I hope that either you consider this version or
Absolutely.
go full on. The problem I want to show, besides just getting back to the problem with writing tests in Razor files, besides IntelliSense, which is much better now in the latest version of Visual Studio, is if I go ahead and hit Control KD, and let me see. I need to mess up my formatting ever
Cleans
so
up a
slightly.
little bit. Yeah.
So if I do this, you can see everything sort of it messes up, and here it even completely destroyed the markup for me. And so I it's another thing I'm hoping the Visual Studio team will help out. So the Razor editor in Visual Studio, let me just hit Control C here to undo, and let's undo a bit more to get back to where we were.
Right.
And so the Visual Studio, I really hope the Visual Studio team, they will help out with this, because the editor really doesn't like these inline render templates syntax things mixed into C#. It doesn't handle it.
It's called obtrusive code. There is a whole talk about it.
I have huge respect for those guys building that editor experience, because it must be super hard to be able to support JavaScript, TypeScript, JSON, CSS, and C# and HTML in the same file here on screen at the same time. So it's not easy. I'm trying to point to the right side of the screen. But if you can avoid this, or if you write your code in Visual Studio Code, then you don't have this, I'm going to format my thing and everything is going to break problem. Then this is a super intuitive way of writing your Blazor tests. So if you sort of ignore the fact that you are actually in a Razor file and just write C# code and have nothing else in here, then this is actually probably the best way of passing in parameters. So, but I want to show off a preview feature that I think you might be useful for you guys in this particular project, because what you're doing, you're wrapping the virtualized component from Microsoft.
Yeah.
And the virtualized component, I actually had to do quite a bit of work in that 5 timeframe to get to work with bUnit. So I've sort of, maybe to my own detriment, committed to supporting the first-party components that come with Blazor, just so that they have that nice
out of the box.
It just works. Yeah. If you throw in Mod Blazor or some other third-party component library, come and ask questions in the bUnit chat room. Lots of people have done that before, and we can usually figure out what you need to do to get that working. Yeah. But for the first party stuff, I do some work there, and bUnit comes with IJS runtime mocking built in, because it's so instrumental to how Blazor component works.
Yeah.
And you access that through, there's something called JS interrupt, and here you can go in and configure invocations. So you can go in and say, well, if somebody wants to do a void call to my func, and they pass in some value, or I don't care what value. So it's sort of inspired by MOQ. So basically, they pass in something, and I'm just going to say, well, I'm going to match with everything, and then I can say set void result. So that just means that if somebody calls my func from like invoke issuing, and it's a void, it's invoke void, then and it's this method, I'm just return right away with no results. So I saw you had in your code you set JS interrupt to loose mode. If you don't have it at loose, then you have it as strict. Then you can go in and configure things like this. So this is built in. And
if you don't set it to loose, Syncfusion will scream at you. That's a problem.
Yeah, because Syncfusion does some JS interrupt behind the scenes. What you can do is you can go in and configure up all those expected calls. So sometimes maybe Syncfusion maybe they have their, why can't I spell Syncfusion like this? Like maybe they have something like this where they have, maybe they have, and I think I have a setup method as well. But you can basically, you can go in and configure it up to say anything that has something to do with Syncfusion, just pretend it doesn't happen. It didn't happen. I don't care about that. But if you have your own JavaScript interaction, then you would use the JS interrupt and set it up, because bUnit runs in C#. There's no JavaScript there at all. So what you would do is you would treat it like another service that maybe calls, if you're writing unit test, you don't want to call your network service, you create an abstraction, and then you mark or fake that and set up your expectations, and then you test those expectations, you test those interactions, and that's sort of supported, built into bUnit. If you don't like bUnit's way of doing that, you can just go into services and add not a fallback, but a singleton of IJS runtime, and then pass in your own mock of that, and then you can.
And it's just gonna.
So
nice.
But because of a virtualized component, as you might imagine, in built into Blazor, it does a whole lot of JS interrupt. It gets talking back and forth. Whenever you're scrolling, the browser is screaming back at you. I scrolled, and then the C# code is doing stuff, and then pulling out new code. And it's so what I ended up doing is I sort of hook in. I try to get bUnit to hook into that, so that if you're using virtualized component in your components and you're writing tests for those components, it will basically, the first time it renders, then I've set up bUnit's JS interrupt to automatically just tell the virtualized component that we've scrolled for like 1 million pixels, so render out everything. So that might make it hard for you guys to test some of the scenarios where you say, I'm going to scroll a little bit and a little bit. Yep. But it was sort of necessary to get that working experience for me. So what I have for you guys instead is something that is sort of a preview feature of bUnit. I haven't documented it yet, so that's why I call it preview, even though it's in a stable build. Nice. It's a way of stubbing components. And here you see an example of this. So another property that was recently introduced on bUnit is component factories. And component factories is it's just a component factory collection. And what is that? Well, a component factory. Let's jump into this guy here. An iComponent factory is just something that you can add to a component factories list. Mm-hmm. And a component factory will be asked by the Blazor renderer when it's being asked to create a component. Can you create this component type? So in our case, it's virtualized. It could be anything. Yep. And if it can, then you get the task of creating that component, and you just have to return something that is an iComponent. So Blazor is duck typing kind of a thing, because so Blazor doesn't care if you say that I can create the virtualized component and you return something that is not a virtual component. Blazor doesn't care, as long as it's able to basically bind, or not bind, but able to pass in all the parameters that was passed to the original component. Then it's going to be happy. So this is very low level component factory. So you're able to create your own custom things. What I did initially in the initial release of this concept is I added something called a stub. So from testing methodology, we know that a stub is something that returns a canned response, but doesn't otherwise really affect the outcome as such. Yep. So so what we can do is I have on component factories, let me try that one again. Component factories. We have add methods similar to what we have on services. So here you can just go in and say, well, I'm going to add my iComponent factory. And let me zoom in on that one. Almost, yeah. So you can create your own iComponent factory. It just has to follow that interface. It's a very simple interface, and that's it. And but you can also add some overload. So if you want to say, I want to stub out we have a label base, I think. If you want to replace that in the render tree with something else, you can also just create your own component. So it can be a fake label base. And you will probably get, the first time you do that, you will probably get some exception from Blazor saying, well, I can't bind all the properties on parameters on label base to that one. And then you will try to match it up. But you can basically create a different component that looks like label-based doc typing, but isn't label-based. And that way you can replace an entire component tree of something. Maybe you're using SyncFusion or some other third party. I'm not picking on SyncFusion, but if you have third-party components that is not important to your test because you shouldn't test
you
other
could just
people's
kind
stuff,
of
you can say, instead of rendering with real thing, render something else that I control.
Nice.
And so one built-in, I won't call it, it's sort of a mix between a stop and a mock, but I'll call it a stop just to lower expectations a bit. But to make it a bit easier to get started, I have something called add stop. And add stop allows me to say, let me delete this again. So component, factories, add stop. Add stop is an extension method, which is sort of sits on top of this. And this allows us to say, if you see something like this, when you're rendering the component, replace it with something called with a stop. And a stop component is this guy down here. We can jump into that. You can see this is just it's part of bUnit test doubles. It's just a stop which implements. It's just a component basically. It's just a custom component I built, and it inherits from something that you can also use component double base. Nice. And a component double base is just an I component. It's just an I component. So. Gotcha. So the stop component, what it does, and you can see how little it takes to create a stop. This is a bad example. If you go into the component double base, the only thing it does is that it has this method here, this parameter called capture unmatched values, and then it captures that into something called captures parameter views. But this is just what you need. So no matter what type of component you're replacing.
It doesn't
in the render tree,
it
doesn't give up because it just says, okay, well, I have all these parameters I want to pass, but because Blazor is on runtime using reflection to find on the type, you give it back when you create a component. You give it a component back, and it will inspect that type and say, okay, you gave me a stop of t. Well, that stop of t only has one parameter, and that's capture all unmatched values. And because we have a whole dictionary of values that we've been passed. We need to pass to that. We're just going to stop it in there. Stuff that in there. If we had we have the child content parameter, if we have the data source parameter, then it would have stopped, added, moved those parameters into those parameter properties. So this is quite elegant. It allows us to do something like this.
So now you're controlling the overscan count on that native. Nice.
Well, I'm not doing anything with. Let me debug this test, and we can have a look what's going on here. So for folks not having looked at the code and maybe not seen all the streams, so bVirtualize component inside of it will initialize virtualize.
The virtualize. Yep.
I think it's down here. No, it's
on
here.
The base level. There it is.
So this is the inside the stomach of bVirtualize. We call this method. So we sort of have two. I usually talk about two trees in a Blazor context. We have the render tree, which represents our components and their hierarchy, and then we have the DOM tree. At least when we are creating HTML with our Blazor components, that's the output, that's the rendered output, so that's a different tree. But what we can do with component factories in bUnit is we can go in and say, well, I actually want to, instead of rendering out, adding a virtualize of type string, because we are passing in string here, I want to have something else in my component tree, in my render tree. And Blazor won't care, as long as it's able to pass in these two parameters that you are passing to virtualize. It should be able to deliver those somewhere, and with the stop component I have, it's able to do that. So I apologize if I'm hand-waving too much, but I hope it makes sense. So if we go ahead and debug this, let's see what's going on here.
Here we go.
So just again, we have from Ultrafixture, we have just three strings, some random strings. And here we just step over and we're just telling it, we're just going to add a stop. So whenever you see something, whenever you see a component that is of type virtualize of string, then replace that with a stop.
Nice.
And here I just have this child content render fragment, because now it doesn't matter to me, but I have to pass it in, because otherwise we're not in a happy path of our component. We are in a failed
Yep,
like we're in the error path. So we just pass in something, and I wrote it up out of here just to make it clear, but we could obviously just have it down here as an inline thing like we had before. So now we just go ahead and render our component. So at this point, we've rendered the component, and we can go and we can see that the markup is pretty boring. We did not put anything. But that's because the builder, there's nothing there. And that wouldn't be either because the virtualized component, we replace that with something else. So what we can do instead of looking at, so when you go, so that's always, let me go do it down here so I can actually zoom in. So the markup, this is the raw markup string that represents the DOM tree. Remember two different trees, DOM tree. This is the DOM tree. If you want to have it as objects, you go to the nodes, and then you have a node list, which is like the document object model you know from the browser, just C# and just JavaScript. If you want to get to the render tree, you use the method called find component or find components plural. So there's also one with an S on it, S, and it will do a depth first search. If we just pass in without an S, it will just do a depth first search until it finds the first component, which is a child component of this component here, the bVirtualize component. So we just say, give me the first stop of virtualize. So now we're going into the tree, and we know that there should be a stop component that represents the virtualize of string that we set to replace with here. So if we step over one time, we now have I call it virtual stop. And if we expand that, virtual stop is, if you will recognize the same properties as we had before from cut. It still has an instance, it still has markup. Well, we didn't produce anything because it's a stop. We also have a node list. It's going to be empty because we didn't produce anything. And we still have all those other things. But what we can do, we can access the instance property here. And if we do that, let me unfold that for you guys. And I'm just going to unfold a little bit more so we can see a bit more what's going on. And let me unfold the keys as well. And now I can zoom in. I hope this is sort of big enough for us. So
I can
we
see
went
it.
into the virtual stop, which is the stop of the virtual component. And if you go into the instance method here, which represents the actual instance of the type in the render tree, we can see here we have a stop of virtualize of 1, which is just because
just an instance.
It's in this case the generic type is string. And here and the only property we have on this stop component is called parameters. And parameters is this catch-all thing that captures the parameters that you originally, in your use of virtualize in your bVirtualization component, this is the parameters you pass to it. And you can see there are 3 parameters we passed. We passed a child content, overscan, and item provider. And obviously it's a dictionary, so you have also the values here. You have they can be hard to read, obviously, because it's lambdas and it's render fragments. So this gives us access to actually, instead of you trying to sort of get the virtualized component to behave like you want it to in a test, now we can just verify that we're actually using it right. We're passing in data to it. And then you're not testing virtualized component, you're just testing that you're interacting with it correctly. So this is some of the things I want to make a bit easier. And I would love your feedback on this. But what we can do then is we can go to the virtual stop, which is so this is a rendered fragment we get back when we use find component. We get a render fragment back.
There you are.
I managed to unmute myself in my excitement here.
I'm excited.
I have a mute button on my microphone, so when I'm waving my hand, I might hit that. So find component returns a render fragment, a render component, and render component has this instant method. And now we get to the parameters captured. Parameters type we have there, and it has some helper methods for us. And similar to what we do up here where we have a parameter selector, parameters has a get method where we can go ahead and select out that thing, because internally this is a dictionary of string to object, because parameters can be any type of object. So we kind of have to store them as an object. So to get out something strongly typed, I have a custom get method where we say I'm going to select the overscan count, and then the output I'm going to get from this and I'm not sure if I can actually hover over this and have it. It's probably not going to give me syntax highlighting or give me that pop-up. But because I'm selecting overscan count, what I get out is something that is an integer. So what we can do, let me stop this and say var, int. I think it's overscan count.
I should give you a void, I think. Oh, you're trying to actually get the value. Gotcha.
So this is just for showing that this method here takes an expression that basically, because it knows that we captured a virtualized string, then it knows that this is again an expression where we go in and select a parameter selector like we had before. So this pulls out the parameter you passed.
Yeah.
And casts it to the right type, because we know Blazor gives us the guarantee that if you're able to pass, if you like in your code here, Blazor will make sure that these types actually are compatible. So we know that even though we have an object internally, we know we can safely cast that to the expected type, because
this here, sir, is why I like you so much. It's a problem. I have a problem, and I'll tell you why. Please don't get a restraining order against me, but let me just tell you what this is.
Yeah.
I have been struggling to mock base components. I just want to test my component. Brian, you know how we mock storage brokers and logging brokers? So I'll take your screen just for a tiny second, Egil.
Go ahead.
Just for a tiny second. This is the most beautiful thing I've seen all day. And I'll tell you why. The second beautiful thing, because both of you are the most beautiful thing I've seen all day. But
now you're just lying.
I'll tell you this.
But I'll take it for the code.
I'll tell you what has been my struggle. Actually, my buddy Josh McCall and I have been actually looking into this for a while, and he tried to kind of turn base components into services so he can mock them, which is our hacky way of doing it. But let me just tell you, Egil, you probably saw this or not. I'll tell you, so we're putting in some sort of an engineering standard where we go and say, okay, you have your services, and then you end up with a component, right? And then when we test drive our services, a component to me is just the equivalent of a service. It's basically a business logic, but just for the UI. When I am testing this service, let's say this is student service right here, right? And student service is dependent on what I call a storage broker. Think of it as a very thin layer that connects your business logic to the outside world without having any hard dependency, right? You don't let that leakage happen into your system. What I like, I'm taking on Blazor from a backend C# guy, a guy that I've been building backend systems, and now I'm trying to kind of make UI make sense thanks to your library and to the work that Steve and Daniel has been doing on Blazor. Now it's simple for us, backend engineers to actually invade the front end, space. But when I test this guy here, what happens? I go and mock this guy completely. So I can control only what this guy is doing and not have to worry what this guy is doing. I don't want to really talk to the database, right? I just want to say, did I make the right call? Now, whatever that guy is doing underneath, none of my business, right? My struggle has been, we do the same thing. It's an intersection between UI components and data components. So what I call a component in here talks to a base component, right? Just like how this storage broker could be talking to a third party component like entity framework. I don't care, because this guy doesn't have to know about this guy. This guy here in here doesn't have to know about this guy. This is why I built that abstraction layer, right? Between the native library, the external library that I'm using, and my actual local pure business logic. Now, base components has been a problematic for us, because what we have been doing is that, let's say I'm using Syncfusion underneath here. Right? And I already built the abstraction layer, which is the base component. So if at any point in time I want to throw away Syncfusion and bring in Telerik, this guy doesn't have to change. That's why we built the base component, right? The biggest problem that I was having, and that's why you would see some odd, weird behaviors like setting JS interop to loose and all that, is because when I'm building, I'm unable to mock this guy. And now you're introducing stub. And now you just made my day so much better. And correct me if I'm wrong. Now I don't have to worry about what the actual base component is doing.
If it's not your code, you shouldn't be testing it, right?
Or if it's a layer of abstraction, right? If it's a layer of abstraction, this is sir, you know what? I need to get you a gift because this is
Oh, you are already doing that, Hassan.
no, no, no. I need you to understand something. You know, consistency to me is paramount,
Hmm.
right? Paramount. If I am introducing backend components, you know, if you saw some of my streams, and I'll tell you what this is. By the way, this is like I said, this is huge. What is this? This is a bUnit core. You know, what version is it? Is it beta? Is that what you just showed
No,
us?
no, no, no. This is in. So I call it like I haven't. I see in net 6 we have this preview fixture we can add, and then we get some new C Sharp 11-ish stuff like the static methods in
Yeah,
interfaces, right?
yeah.
I'm not sure if I can use that preview flag on. The reason I haven't documented it yet. So, but it's
How do I
definitely
get
in.
that stub,
Oh,
Egil? How do I get it?
it's in 1.2 point. It's in the latest one. So it isn't. It
It's
isn't a
already
stable
there.
release. Yeah, it isn't
Okay.
a stable release. It's already
This
out there.
You
So
just
so
give me a big gift today. You
yeah.
have no idea because stubbing these base components was almost Brian, you know what I'm talking about. You have to
Mm.
worry about the dependency of the dependency. Josh McCall, if you're watching this, let's celebrate. Let's buy some pizzas. You know, let's this is it. This is huge. Please document this, but I'm
Yeah.
definitely if you see like 50,000 people jumping in your channel and asking you about stubs, they're probably coming from me, from my
That's
side.
fine. That's fine. Yeah. No. So the reason why I haven't documented it is because one, documentation sucks and it's not fun to write. Even though I have the good guys from Pack Publishing helping
Typical
out with
engineer
editorializing my stuff,
documentation.
but also because there are things I want to make. If you share my screen again,
Yeah. There it is. Yep,
there
yep.
are things like, and I have an issue open for this. I can share the issue link afterwards. I would love
Yeah.
some feedback on this because this is a bit of a mouthful, like this part here, just to get the overscan count out. I would like to make this shorter. I would probably like to have it something, at least be something like perhaps maybe, if we can get it down to, I don't know.
I can't believe. Yeah. Oh
Maybe
man,
not,
this
but
is.
at least this would
Yep.
return the value.
Yep.
But then, what if this was not an overscan count, but maybe this was some like an event callback, and you want to be maybe you have your component under test, the thing you want
Yep.
to test, and it's passing in an event callback to something it's using,
Yep.
and you want to emulate that. That's
I want to
something.
verify that what I passed in is actually what. Yep. Yep. Yep.
Maybe actually so the scenario is that let me go up here. So I have my component, and it's well actually no I have this I don't know fancy third party component here, right? That I'm using, but I don't really want to test. And one of the things I'm passing in, maybe I have a value changed event. And this event, it's an event callback, like classic. So this fancy third party component, it has an event callback property that I can pass something into, and but to get the fancy third-party component to actually trigger this my code that I want to test. I want to test this bit here. I want to test that my component is doing the right thing. My index component is doing the right thing. Then value change is triggered. But to be able to get my fancy third-party component to actually trigger this thing, I have to maybe go in and find that button in that component and click that. But maybe the developer of the fancy third-party component, I'm regretting that name now, changes that. That's internal thing. But like we talked about testing internal implementation details, maybe that person changes how this value is triggered at some point later on, because that's something that person owns, not something I own. Then my test breaks, even though I'm still doing things the right way, because I had to sort of dig into the internals there to just trigger that thing. So what you can do instead is that if we go back to the test here again, then we would have, let me copy paste, then we had get value changed, and that would return the event with the thing, and then you would call invoke on that, and then pass in whatever value you were expecting to get received here. But this is something, here I want to maybe add instead of having get, I want to say invoke, and then I want to select the thing, but then I want to pass in whatever parameters I want to invoke. I haven't figured this through yet, but I want to make it easy to say invoke, for example, if it's an event callback. Maybe I want to say render if this is a render fragment. So you pass in a render fragment, but you want to test that render, like in this case, you're passing in child content that is the template that you want the virtualized components to use whenever it's going to render out stuff. You don't care about all the other goo that the virtualized component is going to spit out, but you care about that your render fragment does the right thing. So if we have, this would be child content, I guess, in this case. If we go back like this and say child content, we have it here, then this is a render fragment of T. So now I get a render fragment of T back, but how do I verify that it does the right thing or is the right thing? Sometimes you can't. You do that, I guess, by calling it, by invoking it, and making sure that it's the right thing. And if you do that, you would get an I. So it would be an I rendered fragment back. And so there needs to be some way of this bit here. So the reason why I haven't documented yet is because right now
you're still kind of exploring.
I'm still exploring this bit. So I'm not expecting to really remove this, but I may be expecting to make some of these additional scenarios easier. And like I mentioned, you can, if you have a specific, like the scenario you were drawing up on screen before, where you have your own base component, which might be a base for a whole bunch of other components you have. Then it might make more sense for you to go in and create your own implementations of I component factory and do something very specific for that, because you can reuse that across all your tests. And then you know. So another trick this stop can do is you can actually you can just do something like this. You can say add stop, and then you can pass in a parameter, a predicate where you say if X, and here you get passed in.
Oh, you can stop generic a bunch of components.
So you can say if you can say namespace equals I guess it would be starts with sync fusion.
You can stop everything in sync fusion and just focus. Oh my god.
Yeah. And then
Ryan, are you seeing this? Are you seeing what this guy's doing? Go ahead.
And then you would still do this down here. Then you would still say, well, I'm gonna find my virtualize of, I don't know what, I haven't used Sync Fusion's components. I'm sure they're great.
Oh, they have SF grid and all that kind of stuff. But
so then they would have they probably have a button, right? So you would go in and find the Sync Fusion button. I don't know what it's called, but something like that probably. And that would be in the tree. So you can also stop like that. And obviously you can go ahead and create your own. And now I'm trying to undo all my squigglies here. So there's a bunch of ways of going around that.
I can't believe, I did not expect to hear that today. This is.
So I've been talking about this a little bit on stream for the last like experiment with this stuff here, but it's I think you're the first third party outside of my own small Twitter universe, Twitch stream universe that I'm showing this off to. But I know also that you are responsible adults and will not come rushing and beating me up if I change one or two things around here, because it's sort of I call it a preview feature because I might want to change one or two things here. But
Egil, this is from an architecture design. You have no, bro. You probably do. You're a smart guy, but you're focusing, which is really something I've been looking for. I've been doing Blazor now for almost 2.5 years since it started, and we started running with it. You have no idea. This is amazing piece into making sure that we're consistent in terms of patterns, mocking our dependencies. I don't want to worry about what sync fusion. I don't want in my test. Did you see sometimes in my test I have to go and say, when I get that fixture, I have to go and say add sync fusion components. I don't want to worry about that. I want to basically stop that guy and be like, it shouldn't be a part of my test, my unit test on the component, that I have to worry about two dependencies downstream. That's not That's not good. You know what I
That's
mean?
that's the motivation for that. Another thing I was trying to do, but I couldn't get exactly right. There were some corner cases that didn't work. Was shallow rendering. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with shallow rendering concept from
Yeah,
React
shallow
or similar,
rendering. Yeah,
where
yeah.
you say instead of render component, you say shallow render this component, and that means it only renders that component and not none of the child components it might have. And you can sort of imagine, I think, how component factories could do this, where you say, but there were some corner cases where it didn't necessarily work. But
Yeah.
this is sort of very close, and especially for what you normally would want to do, where you want to say, I actually don't mind own my own components being rendered
Yep.
when I'm rendering it,
Yep.
but
Yep.
all the third party stuff is usually what you want to throw
That's
away.
it. This is it right there. And also verifying, like with this stubbed component, I can verify that the right stuff has happened there.
It still
Anyway,
passed in the right values to it, yeah.
yes, yes, yes. This is it. This is it. This is the missing piece, my friend. Anyway, we're almost 2 hours in, and
Yeah,
my headset is screaming and saying, "Hey, we're dying." If I completely disconnect, but Eagle, please come back again. This has been really,
I'd love
really
to.
helpful, and
Yeah.
I have behind me here 5,000 subscribers. Always that would love to hear your content, and I'm
Absolutely.
sorry, Brian, you were going to say something. Go ahead,
No,
Brian.
no,
Go
no.
ahead.
I'm really
Yeah.
thankful. Yeah.
Yeah, we're very,
Amazing stuff.
very grateful. We're gonna
Um,
try. Go ahead, Brian. Go
sorry, I'm
ahead.
just.
There's a little delay because it's all the way. So guys watching us, Brian is in Australia, Eagle is in Iceland, and I'm here in Washington in the
You couldn't get
U.S.
further
So we're
apart.
We
mixing.
got the globe covered.
We got it. We got the globe
At
one
least
one
from pole to
circle.
pole.
So if I'm talking and Brian is like, he's still
I
he's.
know I got to watch another 2 hour video because I'm a
Well,
little bit
You'd
tired.
be
It's like 4 a.m.
surprised.
here.
I thought my long hour videos, like I thought my long videos, people are not really watching, and there was like a split second when clicked instead of Draw IO, I clicked Steam, and it popped up Dawn of War for 1 second, and I hit it away, and I said, I'm not gonna trim it for the video, nobody's gonna notice. Immediately in the comment section, hey man, if you like Dawn of War, I'd totally be down. Let's go play Dawn of War. I was like, what? You'd be surprised. You'd be very surprised. Anyway,
yeah,
thank you so very
Yes.
much. I appreciate both of you. Eagle, thank you
likewise.
for jumping in. Please, like I said, come back again. And for the people watching us, if you have any comments, questions, concerns, or compliments, feel free to drop a comment in the comment section. If this is the first time you hear about bUnit, please go follow Eagle. He's a great human being and also a great engineer. Support the guy, support his library. He's actually changing the world one line of code at a time. And we'll see you in another session. Brian and I will continue to take Eagle's recommendations to heart, and we'll start kind of playing around with it. Thank you so very much. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See ya.